Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. Today I'm interviewing Jeanette Elsworth. She's a Senior Communications Officer for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. So what's disaster risk reduction, you ask? In the field, they talk about it as DRR. I'm going to talk to Jeanette about what it is, what their office is doing, and how communities can actually help use the framework, the tools, and the resources that her office has in order to help reduce their risks. So stay tuned. Hi, Jeanette. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me here.
So before we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started off as a journalist. I actually worked in mostly radio journalism at the BBC. I worked in radio current affairs, on global current affairs programs, and a very short stint on business and economics. And then after about 6 years there, I did a very short stint at the British Foreign Office based in Nairobi. And then I joined the United Nations, and I have been working there for the last 10 years as a communications officer in a couple of different roles. I was at UN Habitat, which is the United Nations program for sustainable development, human settlements. And I now work for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction.
Very interesting. So tell me a little bit about the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. What exactly does it do?
So the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we're the focal point in the United Nations system for disaster risk reduction. And really what we advocate for is a shift away from managing disasters to managing risk. So we're really trying to make people more aware about building resilience, understanding the risk that they face to disasters, to hazards that are both natural and man-made, and what we can do to mitigate those. And then we work with communities to build their resilience, and we work with governments to persuade them to implement something that's called the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And we help to monitor their progress and to share experience and see how we're all doing with progress against that particular document.
So you mentioned the Sendai framework. I think it's 2015 to 2020. Is that the timeline? Right.
Exactly.
So I know a number of countries are signatories, including mine, Canada. So can you explain a little bit about that framework and what exactly the framework is meant to do?
So the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030 is one of the major documents of the 2015 agenda. And the others that people probably have heard a little bit more about would be the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Paris Agenda on Climate Change, that's a very famous one. And we've got the COP climate change talks that happen every year in December that people are probably following. And we've also got the New Urban Agenda, which talks about sustainable urban development. So these are the main documents of the United Nations that member states have signed to commit to doing different things. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is the document that helps to outline ways in which we can reduce our risk to disasters and to try to limit the losses, both human and financial and infrastructure losses to disasters by planning before they occur and by building the resilience of communities. And for us, this is a really central piece of the jigsaw puzzle that is the 2015 development agenda, because nothing wipes out development like a disaster. You can lose decades of development gains in one tsunami or one tragic earthquake. So we are trying to persuade governments and partners to really look at and understand their risk, and to try and build resilience into their development plans so that any gains that we make are not lost if the worst occurs.
Yeah, and the ironic thing when you said that, sometimes development actually contributes to the disaster when you put people in harm's way in areas they shouldn't be living, right? I mean, that's what what I talk to a lot of planners and elected officials about. I said, when you put people on floodplains, on coastlines, in forests, sometimes you're actually not making things better. How are you then helping communities? I know as someone reading, say, the Sendai framework, they probably just glaze over and go, oh, I'm not even sure what this means. But from a practical level, how are you helping communities with their resilience, building that?
So that's a very good point, and it really is one of the battles to try to get this particular let's say, field of work looked at and considered within all the development arena. And that's, if you think about developing countries, a lot of them, they have a huge demand on sometimes very limited resources. And so one of the things that we do that really has impact is to try to encourage cross-cutting way to address all these different issues. And ironically, sometimes that actually works better in some of the most vulnerable communities. So if I give you an example of Pacific Islands, Fiji, for example, or Vanuatu, we do a lot of work with the communities there, and they are able to create strategies that cover all the different areas of development, and they're able to do that in a more streamlined way than a large government like Canada could do, because they're so much bigger and they have different departments. So one of the things that we do is to work with our government counterparts to try to persuade that kind of level of cooperation and coordination. It's a way of also accessing financing, which is a very big part of what we do. And we also, at a community level, we work with cities. So we have something called the Making Cities Resilient campaign. We've got nearly 5,000 signatories to that campaign. And we work at a mayor level to, again, to encourage the creation and implementation of disaster risk reduction strategies at a city level. And those can often have a more visible impact on communities. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction is not an implementing agency. So that means that we don't really get into communities and build infrastructure or carry out projects on the ground. Our projects really are about coordinating and bringing people together. So yeah, it is easy to say that you don't often see the results of what we do, and that's very true. That's one of the challenges I face as a communicating in this particular field. Yeah. But we have these very big and very engaged events. We have a global platform for disaster risk reduction. We have regional platforms. We encourage workshops in different countries as well. One of the things that we do is we have a training center. So we bring practitioners of local governments into our training center, and we give them training in this particular area, and then they go out and implement what they've learned in their day-to-day work. So there is a lot going on. At a community level, I would say one of the most important things we do is share stories of resilience. That might sound like a small thing, but it's very important for communities to see how other communities are doing and to get ideas from the things that other people are doing. That way we see a lot of cross-pollination of ideas and people using them in other contexts. And so we can't really underestimate the importance of communicating resilience.
Oh, very much. I know we do, some of the work I do, it's around economic development, economic recovery. And so we'll take in technical teams, and it's their experience. It's not just a theory to them. It's their experience that they can say, I did this worked, this did not work. And so I would recommend you do something different or similar, depending. But you're right, like being able to share from a real tangible way what works, that can be very, very valuable for communities for sure. When you're looking, I know you're looking more from an educational standpoint, an awareness standpoint, putting frameworks and tools, those kinds of things together. But would you say that there are some common challenges or even opportunities that communities have going forward in this whole area of disaster risk reduction?
Yes, so one of the biggest challenges that we have is actually access to disaster loss data. One of the things that we do as part of the Sendai framework monitoring is that we gather loss data and we put that into a common tool available online so that governments can report on their disaster losses. But we find that data is very variable in different parts of the world, in different countries, and we have lots of challenges like disaggregation of data so that we're not sure, even within a country, if one part of the country is more exposed than another. All the countries are at different levels on this. So that's one of the biggest challenges, I would say. One of the other challenges is the understanding just how important this field can be. And we are finding that disaster risk reduction is now spilling over and crossing over into all the other challenges that we're facing. So we know now that 90% of disasters are actually climate and extreme weather related. So it's actually not just the long-term impact of climate change, but also the short-term impacts that we're seeing exacerbated in disaster, manifested in disasters already. One of the other challenges I would say would be reaching the vulnerable parts of community. We actually believe that women are up to 14 times more likely to be killed in a disaster event than men. We have lots of different statistics about people with disabilities, and we have projects to try to reach people in vulnerable sections of communities to make sure things like early warning systems are working for them. Do they know what to do? Is the community aware? And one of the opportunities I would say that goes with this is that when you do that level of community engagement and you bring the whole of the community together, resilient communities are more resilient for everybody. So it really isn't just you should do that because it's the right thing to do, but it really is the right thing to do for everybody.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And I agree. You know, it's to me, it's sometimes I break it down into three levels. I say, so if every individual was more prepared, more resilient, so they had the tools and the means to look at their house and what they do on a daily basis and become more resilient. And then you take it to a business level. You know, what does your business do to be more resilient? And then that community-wide level. Because when you think about it, if you got all three levels to an acceptable level, you'd probably see less impact because people have thought about it, they've made changes, and they're more resilient as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And those all those different levels, they add up to some really impressive figures. I mean, we're finding that $1 invested in pre-disaster resilience building and planning can save something in the region of up to $15 in post-disaster recovery. So it really just does make economic sense to do it that way around.
I would love to see that stat, because the one we use in our training, I think it's a FEMA stat, and they say for every dollar it's 6 to 7. But if you're seeing 15, I'd love to be able to see where that's from, because that's pretty impressive.
There's actually lots of different stats, and that's the one that we use the most. I'll dig out the stat for you. And we have seen anything up to $60. And so I think it really does depend on the context that you're using it in, and perhaps in more developing contexts or developing country contexts, you could probably see even greater return for that investment.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, I'm just curious, is there anything else that you are working on that you'd like to share, or anything we might have missed, maybe around, what's the one thing, if the community is tuning in, to say, what's your biggest bang for your buck? If you're going to look at this area, what should you do first?
Well, I think the one thing that I would say is that the Sendai framework lays out that it is government's responsibilities to do a degree of this work, but that we all need to take responsibility. And that goes back to what you were saying about all the different levels. I think it's very easy for individuals to not really see how they can make an impact in this particular area, because it does feel like, oh, but you're talking about building earthquake-safe houses, or making sure a bridge is secure. But that's not the case at all. Really, it's down to all of us at every level, and whether that is getting more involved in your community DRR strategy, which if you're in a prone area, that would be a very very key thing to get involved in, or just knowing what to do in the case of a disaster or in case of exposure to a hazard. If you're in a tsunami-prone area, do you know what the drill is? Do you know where the evacuation routes are? Those are things that we all have to take responsibility for. So I think that would be the first thing. It's up to everybody, and we're all part of that resilience picture.
Yeah, no, and I think that's great because government can't do it alone. The private sector can't do it alone. We do all need to share that whole of society piece and see where our little piece can be. Well, Jeanette, thank you so much for the work you're doing, and stay in touch for sure. If there's any other issues that come up, I will be contacting you because I do think that some of the work you're doing is, from that global level, is really important to help set that framework for other countries. Obviously, we'll all do it in our own way based on our resources. But at the end of the day, if the investment is $1 for every 15 you're going to save, that's a pretty good return on investment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.